Welcome members of UUCA and Rodef Shalom, who in separate trips last year visited Israel and Palestine. We are gathered here today to visit with Mr. Dylan Williams, who leads the government affairs team for J Street and who has been named the Hill newspaper top lobbyist 5 years in a row. Before joining J Street in 2009, Mr. Williams was counsel for foreign relations for Olympia Snowe, Republican senator from Maine. Mr. Williams will address the issue, Israel and Palestine, where do we go from here? We also welcome visitors from Colami and the Jewish Islamic Dialogue Society. While this program was originally presented as a visual Zoom meeting, today we have the audio presentation of that session originally presented on April 22nd. There follows the audio of that program.
Good friend Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs, Rabbi Stephanie Bernstein, Alan Kellum, Herb Levy, and of course my friend Bud Henskin. I'd also want to point out that my colleague Amos Gill is also on the call, and it really is both a privilege to speak to you tonight and a comfort as well. You know, we are gathered tonight at a very difficult moment for so many of us in so many ways with the crisis going on, and it's frankly nice to have around dinner time a discussion about the issues of the day, as so many of us do around our family tables. In my case, dinner in my childhood home was usually a fairly lively conversation between me and my Jewish mother and my Protestant-raised father. So in that regard, this particular gathering of Temple Rodef Shalom and the Unitarian Universalist Church is especially feeling like home to me at a moment when we can all use a little bit more feeling like we are with our loved ones. Of course, we're meeting tonight right in the midst of a new union that is sure to generate lots of conversation, and that is the union between Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and the person who had been his primary political opponent, Benny Gantz. So let's start there with the formation of this new Israeli government that is still taking shape. First of all, I'd like to lay out what we know about the government that's taking shape, its policy positions, as well as the official positions of the Palestinians, as well as the United States. Starting with Israel, after 3 elections, we now have what is termed an emergency unity government forming. There are myriad factors and agreements that have gone into the difficulty and complexity of forming this government. Among those was haggling between Benny Gantz and those he represents and Netanyahu's party over what this unity government would agree to in terms of annexation, that is, extending Israeli sovereignty and officially annexing some, much, or all of the West Bank in the Palestinian territory. What the agreement that has been reached between Netanyahu and Gantz provides for related to annexation is not as clear as it could be, but what we know is in the agreement is as follows, that annexation will be considered in about 70 days, on or about July 1st. Annexation will move forward only with the consent of the United States and only pursuant to a vote either in the Israeli cabinet or in the Knesset. And I'll note that most observers think that such a vote would pass either in the cabinet or in the Knesset. That's what we know so far about the official Israeli government positioning at the moment. On the Palestinian side, the official position of the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people, as recognized by Israel, by the United States, Palestinian Authority, What would be the reaction of the Palestinian street? Would the Palestinian Authority even survive? And of course, looking at our own community and our own government, what would the next US president do? Will the president in January of 2021 still be Donald Trump? What will Congress do? What does all this mean for US Jewish relations with Israel and the relationship of other communities here in the United States to Israel? I just want to be clear that I don't have answers to all of those questions, but rest assured, I do have an opinion. It is my belief, it is the belief of a majority of Jewish Americans that unilateral annexation would be a disaster. It would be a disaster in three specific respects. First, it would be a disaster for Israeli and Palestinian security. Secondly, it would be a disaster for Israeli democracy and Palestinian rights. And third, it would be a disaster for the US-Israel special relationship. The sum of all this is really even worse. And if you package those three things together, what we are talking about is a disaster for Israel's ability to survive as a democratic homeland for the Jewish people. And now I'm going to actually ask you something that you might not expect from a lobbyist and an advocate, and that is that you please don't take my word for it. I'd ask you to take the word of the experts and the people whose lives this will impact most directly. Take the word of 200 Israeli former generals and general equivalents who warned just this month in a statement published by the Israeli group Commanders for Israel Security, in which they said, quote, unilateral annexation has the potential to ignite a serious conflagration. Any partial annexation is likely to set in motion a chain reaction over which Israel will have no control, leading to the collapse of the Palestinian security agencies and of the Palestinian Authority. This in turn would require Israel to take full control over the entire West Bank and assume responsibility for the lives of its 2.6 million Palestinians. Such unilateral steps would jeopardize the peace treaty and security cooperation with Jordan, coordination with the Palestinian security forces, and the very Jewish character of the state. Some of you may be familiar with former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro, who is still living in Israel and very active in the political, the issues surrounding the politics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the geopolitics of it. His view is that, quote, the logical conclusion of annexation is a single non-democratic state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And that eventually will fundamentally alter the nature of the relationship between Israel and the United States. Echoing Dan Shapiro earlier this month were 130 Jewish communal leaders. And we're talking here about former heads of the Conference of Presidents of major Jewish organizations, former AIPAC presidents and CEOs, heads of the Jewish Federations of North America, who wrote to Gantz warning against annexation. They said that annexation, quote, will make it more challenging for American Jewish leaders as they seek to maintain strong support for Israel and pro-Israel policies at this time. Should annexation be advanced, the majority of American Jews who oppose such a policy will feel more alienated from Israel as a result. Just yesterday morning, end quote. Just yesterday morning, a prominent member of Knesset, Yair Lapid, who until just a few weeks ago was Benny Gantz's coalition mate in running against Netanyahu, warned of irreversible damage to our relations with the Democratic Party and the American Jewish community in the United States. So what does all this mean for the future of Israel and for the future of Palestinians? In the short term, obviously what we're talking about is not only continued deprivation of Palestinian rights and suffering of the Palestinian people, as well as Israelis who suffer from the conflict as well and the violence it inherently creates. But what we're talking about is the end of the possibility of creating two states living side by side in peace and security, in which both peoples can exercise their full political rights and ensure all of the other rights attended to that, including human rights. Ambassador Dennis Ross, who I think many of you know, is to the right, shall we say, of a lot of the positions that J Street takes, and a veteran U.S. negotiator on these issues, warned this week that if Netanyahu moves to implement annexation, that one state for two peoples is eventually the more likely outcome. Former IDF Colonel Shaul Arieli, who many of you might know, has engaged on the question of borders very intensely over the years on this, put it very succinctly when he said, annexation will be the final blow to the Zionist vision of a democratic state with a Jewish majority, which upholds a society in the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. For those who aren't familiar with Israel's Declaration of Independence, it is perhaps one of the great documents of the world and of history that talks about not only the aspirations and the longing of the Jewish people for a state of their home, but the absolute necessity that that state be a democratic one and be the state of all of its citizens, whoever they are and whatever their background. So who should fight against annexation if these are the costs to Israelis, to Palestinians, and to the relationship between the United States and Israel? Well, I mean, I can think of three categories. First of all, Zionists. If anyone out there like me is a Zionist, we have our whole project at stake here if we cannot sustain Israel as a democratic homeland for the Jewish people. Who else should care? Those who want Palestinians to have their suffering ended, to have the occupation ended, so that Palestinians can enjoy their full political human rights in a sovereign state of their own, and who don't want Palestinians to have to suffer anymore to achieve it, because what lies ahead is decades of suffering in the face of an annexation. And lastly, anyone who cares about the rule of law, democracy, peace, or the inherent humanity of all people. Because at the end of the day, this conflict, duly or otherwise, attracts so much attention and scrutiny from the rest of the world. And at the end of the day, what all people of goodwill want to see this conflict resolved in is something that is an enduring peace that provides for the rights and dignity of both peoples. So if you fit into one of these categories, if many of you fit into two or three of these categories, and I think a person can fit into all three, and I certainly like to count myself in them, you should be against annexation and joining the call in the next 70 days to really fight against it and try to convince those around Benny Gantz, those around Benjamin Netanyahu, even our own administration to some extent, that despite the rhetoric they've engaged in, despite the green lights that they've given each other over these 3 rounds of Israeli elections, that now is the time to, at a minimum, pump the brakes and prevent a disaster that is in no one's interest. If you are interested in joining that work, please don't hesitate to email me at dylan@jstreet.org, DYLAN @jstreet.org. But let me stop there and leave as much time for your questions as possible. And thank you so much again, everyone.
One question that came up through the chat from the participants on this Zoom session was had to do with the PLO and the Palestinian Authority. You mentioned both of those, but could you clarify to us the distinction between the two? Thank you.
So there's these two official institutions of the Palestinian government, and the best way to think of them is the PLO is kind of the entity of state of the Palestinian people. It is the international representative that is recognized since for many decades now as the official representative on the world stage of the Palestinian people. It's recognized as such by the United States, by the Israeli government, and by nearly every international organization and country in the world. The Palestinian Authority is what one might think of as the government entity, the governing entity, the entity responsible for administering the domestic internal affairs of the territory of Palestine under its control.
Both Temple Road of Shalom and the Unitarian Universalist Church of Arlington had travelers from our congregation who, in delegations from each congregation, went to Israel and to Palestine in the past year. And some of these initial questions come from those travelers. This question submitted earlier has been overtaken by events with the forming of the new Israeli government, but I'll ask it and you can update your answer to it. What are the implications for a two-state solution under three possible Israeli governments, one led by Likud, one led by blue and white, or a unity government?
Sure, it's a great question. I think, nothing's for certain, but achievement of a true two-state solution would have been unlikely in the extreme under Likud government, a right-wing government in which Likud had cobbled together purely right-leaning parties and members of Knesset. Under a blue and white government, had it existed, and it would depend on who the coalition partners are, I think you would have some chance, a non-insignificant chance, of actually achieving progress toward, if not actual achievement of, a two-state solution. A government in which the security-oriented luminaries of Israel had as the prime minister, the prime minister, their chief representative, is a government for which there's a possibility to actually make real progress towards a two-state solution. Under a unity government, as structured, I think it's fairly clear that this is not a government that is going to, in good faith, make any progress towards a two-state solution. Netanyahu is clearly the senior partner in this, and that's just in numerical terms. He gets the first run at being prime minister, and I think it's even in doubt if Benny Gantz will ever get to rotate into the prime ministership. And this is a coalition that is not comprised of MKs that would support a two-state solution as it's been envisioned for decades.
Given that Trump's peace plan is a non-starter and Israel is talking about annexing settlements, it seems like hope for a two-state solution is dead. Would it be useful to forget efforts towards a two-state solution, face reality, and talk of living with or dealing with a one-state reality with Israel as sovereign over Israel, the West Bank, and perhaps Gaza as well?
So I don't think I'm going to surprise anyone with the first part of my answer, which is no. I think it's incredibly important not to abandon the objective of a two-state solution. But what may surprise you is the reasoning behind it. I think a two-state solution is inevitable. The reason it's inevitable is because if in the current political environment, Israelis are so resistant to giving up a fraction of the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River in the name of ending the conflict, it is inconceivable that they are ever going to agree to giving up 100% of the land. I would like to hear the political argument which explains how Israelis are going to accept that. That just seems like a non-starter given the politics, because of the politics, domestic politics in Israel, as well as other factors. So the question really is, when is Israel, when are Israel and the Palestinians going to both have the political will and leadership to agree to a two-state outcome? If they do so sooner, they avoid decades of bloodshed and decades of growing isolation and anger, frankly, on the world stage, particularly against Israel. Our point as J Street is, let's avoid that bloodshed. Let's avoid that isolation and demonization of Israel. Let's agree to a two-state solution now and lay the groundwork here in the United States for a U.S. government that is going to actively push the parties to understand that it is in their political and practical interests to accept that now as opposed to later.
This question's about annexation. Obviously, there's opposition to annexing the whole West Bank. Can there be just limited annexation of settlements? Basically, what degree of annexation can there be without major problems?
That's a really excellent question, and I think it's one that's going to come into play. Just thinking in terms of strategy, if the new Israeli government wants to proceed toward annexation, fulfill its promise that it made to its right-wing voters, one could imagine that they might actually try to engage in a very limited annexation up front, perhaps limited to the so-called settlement blocks that most people think would be part of Israel anyway, if there were to be a mutually agreed upon swap of land as part of a negotiated. But even that limited annexation, as the commanders for Israel's security, who I quoted, noted, runs this incredible risk of devolving into a situation where Israel very quickly has to take over responsibility for the entirety of the West Bank, in addition to changing much of their legal structure to accommodate the fact that they're going to be annexing land and not providing citizenship to any Palestinians. So the short answer is that even a limited annexation risks a full-on need for Israel to reclaim control of the entirety of the West Bank and administer it, and therefore leads to a full annexation and a deepening of occupation.
Do you see any silver lining in the recent formation of the new government, the unity government under Netanyahu? And how might the Yamina party figure into the equation?
In terms of opportunity, as dire as this moment seems, that prior to this forming government, Netanyahu was often the most liberal member of his own cabinet. So this government, although it is set up to do bad things pursuant to the coalition agreement that was finalized a few days ago, at least provides an address within the Israeli government, for people who do support a negotiated agreement, for people who do oppose annexation, for people who do want to see the occupation ended. It provides an address for them to go to that is an official Israeli government address, and that is worth something. And that is also where advocates like myself are focusing our energy in the next 70 days. Oh, and on the Yamina question, is anybody's guess. It is anybody's guess. There's
Obviously, the United States plays a big role, and our policies are important. What can we do? What can we communicate? What goals should we have to help the Israel-Palestine peace at this time?
It's really three things. Number one, the primary goal has to be to stop and do whatever we can to stop annexation by communicating to the decision makers, both in Israel and in our own administration, that annexation is just going to take something which is already an uphill climb and turn it into a nearly insurmountable disaster. So that's number one. Number two is, frankly, to continue to change how here in the United States this issue is discussed and how lawmakers and policymakers their own constituents' positions on this. And, this is the primary area of work of J Street. For decades, it was just considered the rules of the game that Jewish Americans in particular expected members of Congress to adhere to a fairly right-wing perspective when it came to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think what J Street has proven in its 12 years is that in fact, the opposite is true. Jewish Americans overwhelmingly support an approach to Israel-Palestine by the U.S. government that is much more geared towards pushing the parties towards a two-state solution to make the concessions necessary for peace. And that, again, is on both sides. We've done polling consistently and found that supermajorities of Jewish Americans not only support a two-state solution as envisioned by international consensus and the Geneva Initiative and all that, but that they actually support calling both parties out when they are taking steps that are harmful to peace. And that is not what this administration, not what this U.S. administration is doing, but it is increasingly what the United States Congress is doing. Just last year in December, the United States House of Representatives overwhelmingly, or I should say on a bipartisan basis, actually passed a resolution that was annexation and endorsed a two-state solution along the lines envisioned by the parameters laid out by Secretary of State John Kerry at the end of the Obama administration in December 2016. So continuing to change political perceptions here is the second piece. The third piece is we do have to address the humanitarian conditions on the ground. We support security aid to Israel because we want to ensure the safety and security of Israelis. It is also critical that people of goodwill and the United States support the rights and well-being of Palestinians. And that means trying to, as much as we can, not only push for an end to occupation, but ameliorate the deprivations of it. And this is particularly the case in the Gaza Strip, where I'm sure, as you know, there's a humanitarian situation which has already rendered the Strip nearly uninhabitable, and that's only going to get worse over time.
On the call tonight, we have people who worship in synagogues, who worship in churches, and who worship in mosques. We're coming, almost all of us, from faith perspectives. What advice can you give us about how we can help with this situation? And perhaps you have some examples of what we might do. Absolutely.
So, in line with the three things people in general can do to try and end this conflict and ameliorate the hardships that are inherent to it, communities of faith can, to the extent they're comfortable doing so and within their bylaws and best practices, of course, join those efforts in trying to shape the perspectives of decision makers. So organizing in your place of worship and within your faith community to communicate to your representatives in Congress what you want them to say and do on this issue. And in the coming weeks, there are going to be opportunities, on vehicles, letters, other things on Capitol Hill, all virtually, of course, that whereby members of Congress are going to try and get their colleagues to join them in expressing heightened opposition and real concern about annexation. Letting members of Congress know in an organized fashion that that is what your community wants, or at least this, listed subset of your community wants, that's incredibly helpful. What's also helpful is lending your name, either organizationally or as individuals, as appropriate, to efforts that are going to be directed at the Israeli government directly. There is a long tradition in the American Jewish community, for example, of organizing letters and other campaigns to fight for various aspects of things that benefit Israel. That is good and appropriate. Annexation is something that hurts Israel, just like some of the other challenges Israel faces. And so faith communities, in particularly Jewish organizations, should feel empowered and feel the urgency of lending their name to those efforts as well. For non-Jewish faith communities, again, communicating directly to members of Congress, reaching out to organized faith communities in Israel as well, which obviously has a substantial Christian presence and a substantial Muslim presence, both within the Arab population of Israel and, of course, in the Palestinian territory. Making those connections and expressing jointly concern is almost always a good thing. In terms of what has proven effective in terms of grassroots advocacy recently, we have started to see some loosening of the administration in terms of humanitarian aid. Now, it's just benefiting Palestinians amid the coronavirus crisis. Now, it's really just a drop in the bucket and not something to be celebrated, but it is something to be noted that even this administration is subject to pressure enough to reverse or at least allow exceptions to its own policies with respect to Israel-Palestine. I think the single thing in the past year or two that I would say is the greatest on-the-ground grassroots victory really is the survival of a number of Palestinian villages in Area C of the West Bank that have long been slated for demolition by the Israeli government in order to clear space for settlement expansion. And these villages, you might be familiar with some of the names like Susya, like Khan al-Ahmar, have been the subject of not just coordinated congressional action, which J Street has been happy to play a role in, but also real grassroots advocacy, particularly by students here in the United States, many of which have been organized through our on-campus college program, J Street U, as well as other organizations and churches that have organized under the banner of different groupings. And I think that has made a real difference in raising awareness and essentially protecting these communities from demolition, which otherwise almost certainly would have happened, especially in the political turmoil and jockeying of the past 3 election cycles.
Finally, we have several questions that have come in through the chat feature, and I think you have those before you. If you could go through those. Basically, they're questions about one-state versus two-state solutions, about generational change, these generational shift over time as well as partisan shift, about whether Bibi's legal problems play into a solution somehow, about humanitarian aid, which was completely cut off by the Trump administration, about the role of Palestinians in a solution, Abbas versus Hamas, the roles that they might play, and finally, one last question about a one-state versus two-state solution. Thank you.
Sure. Let me start with the last one. I think that came from Rabbi Sachs, and I'm happy to answer it. So I don't think the two-state solution is ever really dead, or is not likely to be dead as a result of things that are now in contemplation, like annexation, although annexation makes it so much more difficult and makes the conflict so much worse and bloodier. The reason I don't think it's ever really dead is because what is done by people can, for the most part, be undone by people. Things even like settlement expansion, as much as a problem of settlement expansion is, it's just a fact that most of the people Israelis who live over the Green Line, live in settlements that are fairly close to the Green Line that can be easily swapped and incorporated into internationally recognized Israel, where 75% of settlers, or even 80% of Israelis living over the Green Line, can remain in their homes and communities. There are all of these creative solutions. Now that, again, gets much harder in the case of annexation, where further out settlements, start to be regarded as part of Israel. But at the end of the day, if you have an Israeli government that is committed to actually achieving a two-state solution, it is a question of political will and not physical impracticality of actually giving effect to a two-state solution. And in terms of what is the actual practical likelihood, well, if they're not going to agree to it now, and if unfortunately they don't agree to it in the foreseeable future, we're talking 3-4 years, that kind of a horizon under what I hope is a new U.S. president, let's look at what's going to happen. The conflict will deepen. There will be more Palestinian suffering. There will be more ire directed at Israel. Israel will grow increasingly isolated on the world stage. There will be a shift away from alliance with Israel toward punishing Israel. And that is not a situation a country can sustain if it's going to remain anything other than, a really bizarre aberration like North Korea or something. Israel and its people are not set up to be a pariah state. That kind of pressure, as much as we at J Street abhor it and fight against it, it is the inevitable result of steps like annexation and failure to achieve a two-state solution. There will come a time that Israel's under such pressure that they're going to have to make greater concessions than they would have to make now. That, again, is something we're trying to avoid. But that is why, at that moment, when that pressure is built up, what is Israel going to decide? Is Israel going to decide to give up the whole project and agree to one state in which every person between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River is a citizen of that state and has a vote? I don't think that's likely. I can't even imagine an Israeli polity that would agree to that. They're going to try and negotiate for some version of the two-state solution. It's just that they're not going to get as good a deal as they would if it happened sooner. I'm going to go up in reverse order. Hamas and Abbas. Obviously, Hamas and groups even more extreme than Hamas continue to be a problem, and there are numerous ways in which President Abbas and those around him have made mistakes in the past. The fact remains at the moment, though, that at the start of the Trump administration, President Abbas and the Palestinian Liberation Organization actually did what most countries did, which was try to flatter Trump and play along and say they actually had some hope that this crafty, creative businessman might come up with a deal that could work for everybody. And over the course of now 3 years, that's not what panned out for them. Nevertheless, Abbas is still the only figure of the three, Netanyahu, Trump, and Abbas, who openly supports a two-state solution, does agree to negotiations, although with certain conditions, namely that the United States not be the one convening, and is still trying to, or is still touting a two-state solution even when Trump and Netanyahu haven't. So while there are steps the Palestinians could take to make it easier to raise some goodwill on the Israeli side, Abbas is not the primary obstacle to a two-state solution here, and remains someone who probably could, given the right combination of an American president who genuinely wants a two-state solution and an Israeli government that can be brought along to it, would be able to achieve a two-state solution. Development assistance for Palestinians and humanitarian assistance related to COVID, absolutely. There have been a number of letters by members of Congress over the past 3 weeks or so addressed to the administration, urging that the administration release at least the funding that has already been appropriated by Congress to benefit the Palestinian people. The result of that push, as I mentioned earlier, had been a limited release of funds, about $5 million, when in fact the Congress has appropriated $75 million that has been reprogrammed by the administration. So it's just a start, but there are literally now dozens of members of Congress, many of whom we've helped to organize this effort, pushing for an even greater assistance from the United States to the Palestinians during this crisis. I'll just quickly dispense with the likely outcome of Bibi's legal troubles. I don't think anyone knows. I think what's certain, though, is Bibi has proven himself an absolute master at gaming the political system and gaming the political system to reform the judiciary and avoid laws that are, that would likely result in at least his ouster, if not his conviction. So I don't think anybody can predict with any accuracy what the outcome of all of that is going to be. The last one I wanted to address is really the most interesting, one of the most interesting things, which is the generational and partisan shifts over time on this issue. What we have now is a situation where the Democratic Party has, by and large, and I'm talking about 95% of elected Democratic officials at the national level and otherwise. The Democratic Party is kind of standing alone right in the middle of the long-standing bipartisan consensus on Israel-Palestine. It is the Democratic Party that is defending the policies of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush when it comes to Israel-Palestine. It is not the Democrats that as a party have shifted. It is the Republican Party, the mainstream of the Republican Party, that starting at the outset of the Obama administration decided to partisanize Israeli-Palestinian policy in the United States, and they made it as part of their effort to try and characterize Barack Obama as insufficiently in line with quote-unquote Judeo-Christian values, insufficiently supportive of natural American allies, insufficiently American. That was the decision, the tactical decision that was made by at the time, the right wing of the Republican Party. That has now become a predominant theme, the theme that by standing firm on what long-standing U.S. policy has been is somehow anti-Israel is a talking point that has emerged in recent years, and it is doing incredible damage to the bipartisanship that had existed. Accompanying that, and part of that, is the rise of evangelical Zionism. And this is transforming the issue into one that almost has a culture war status for certain types of Republican voters in the United States. It is not an accident, though it is horrific and so sad to see as a supporter of Israel, that when you look at pictures or videos of Trump rallies, you will see Confederate flags and you will see Israeli flags, right? And that is an absolute desecration to those of us who are Jewish and who love Israel and want the best for it, to see it flown in that fashion. But that is because of deliberate efforts by the Republican Party, evangelical Zionists, and I want to be clear, with the full support and encouragement of pro-Israel groups to J Street's right, to make support for the notion of the Greater Israel Project synonymous with the notion of being pro-Israel and synonymous with the notion of being pro-Jewish. And that has radically shifted how elected Republican officials who themselves are beholden to more and more radical primary voting bases have shifted on this issue. And remember, I'm saying this as someone who worked as a Senate Republican aide at the outset of the Obama administration. And so that really is the most significant shift, aside from Jewish Americans under the banner of J Street and other organizations organizing for the first time to actually show members of Congress that Jewish Americans are not overwhelmingly on the right of this, on the right-wing side of this issue, but in fact are in a much more, a position that's much more aligned with what the longstanding bipartisan consensus has been. Let me just give a note about generational changes. I think that's still undecided. When you look at the Jewish American community in particular, you do see a lot more vocal identification among younger Jewish Americans with progressive values, left-wing movements, and part of that is fully embracing Palestinian rights and wanting to end the occupation, independent of what one thinks about Israel. So the primary focus is Palestinian rights for a growing chunk of Jewish Americans. That reflects an increasing organization and alignment among left-wing groups, including communities of color in the United States and other similarly situated organizations, of which Jewish Americans, younger Jewish Americans, are proudly and rightly an active part. At the same time, you also do see growth in more conservative pockets of the Jewish American community. If you look at the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox, they are a growing share of younger Jewish Americans. So it's not quite certain how the generational shift actually works out. And I will note that in terms of looking beyond the Jewish community, in terms especially of communities of color that are, of course, the fastest growing component of the American society, as it has always been, the more recent immigrants are the ones that increase their share overall of the American voting base. They increasingly do identify with Palestinian rights as another community that is subject to systemic unfairness. And it is in many ways refreshing to see Palestinian rights attain the same level of importance as other rights to other communities here in the United States. But at the same time, it does shift the dynamic. And you have, a situation where more and more self-identifying progressives, people who, are the growing left flank of the Democratic Party, are coming at this not necessarily from a pro-Israel perspective or even a pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian perspective, where I would count myself, but more from a mainly pro-Palestinian perspective.
Dylan, I'd like to thank you very much for this talk and the sense of urgency that came along with it, and also the sense of sharing this around the table, so to speak, with family and friends. Special thanks to Bud Henskin of Unitarian Universalist Church of Arlington for arranging for you to come as a speaker. Thanks to Rabbi Jeffrey Sachs of Temple Road of Shalom for co-sponsoring this with us, for Herb Levy to getting the word out to Kolami.
It's been wonderful to share this time with all of you.
Good night.
Thank you for the question.
Fantastic, clear presentation. Thank you, Dylan.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.